1944, Falaise pocket. Mud gleamed like old metal under a sick sky. The taste of dust and iron lingered on the tongue. Lantern light trembled across a stretcher as a pocket watch lay open on a palm, its brass face rimmed with dried mud. Nearby, a canvas pack hissed with rain, a medic's armband slapped against a thigh, and the odor of morphine sat faint in the air. Voices folded into the rumble of distant shells. "He's the enemy. He's a patient. You'll be marked a deserter." June slid her fingers under the collar of the young man, feeling a pulse like a thin thread. The watch hand clicked, measuring out seconds she did not have. She moved him away from the cue as a gloved hand went for her arm. Then the ground shuddered with a nearer blast. The lantern swung, and her thumb closed over the watch as she, mercy where hate was expected. In the mud of Falaise, Nurse June McLeod ignores an order to leave prisoners untreated, reading a thinning pulse and choosing the oath over an officer's command. She wraps a bandage, gives a measured dose of morphine, and moves an enemy soldier into the priority slot meant for evacuations, a quiet act that turns protocol into a moral question under shellfire. Her jaw set against the cold. Rain tapped the canvas like a metronome. Arthur hovered, fingers clenched around a clip of paperwork, not yet a voice of command. The officer's glare cut through the lantern haze, but June's hand stayed on the young enemy soldier's chest, steadying breath with the quiet mechanics of care. That small, deliberate touch changed the tally of who got a stretcher. They were in a battered aid station pressed into a ruined farmhouse outside Falaise, August 1944, a small node of the field hospital system, where medics and nurses worked in shifts under a sky that kept wanting to fall. June McLeod served as senior nurse at the dressing station. Stabilize, pack, send. Trucks arrived with wounded from the front, and that day, a line of surrendered enemy soldiers. Supplies were thin. Morphine ampules counted like treasure. Bandage rolls frayed. Stretchers few. And shelling could cut the road at any hour. Triage was the rule. Patients are sorted by who will live with immediate help, a practical calculus in a place of constant risk. The Geneva Convention was a quiet paper that still mattered here. The rule that a wounded man is protected and a medic must remain neutral. The nursing oath June carried was no abstract line. It asked that she treat the dying man at her hands the same as any comrade. In mud and smoke, protocol met conscience, and she kept choosing the oath over the uniform of whoever lay in front of her. A rumble of tracked vehicles pushed mud against the low stone wall as the line of prisoners was walked through the farmhouse yard. They moved in a single, shaky file, hands empty, eyes shuttered. June watched them from the open flap of the aid tent. The Red Cross, painted, on canvas catching a smear of rain. One young man clutched at his belly and staggered. His pale lips formed no words. The orderly at the gate barked a rule: no treatment for prisoners without escort. June stepped forward, pocket watch heavy in her palm, and felt the pulse that told her which side of the timeline he stood on. "Not for us," the orderly said. "Check him," Arthur replied, voice low. She lifted a shirt, found damp fabric and a shallow, fast pulse, then tied a folded bandage tight enough to slow the bleed, but not so tight as to cut circulation. A single morphine ampule was broken between her thumb and forefinger. Relief, not a cure. She wrote his name down as best she could and marked his card with a hurried cross. The tent filled with the soft noises of other patients, a cough, a whispered prayer. but June's hands kept moving. Compress, dress, stabilize. The line watched and counted the distance she closed between the rule and the man on the stretcher. Treating him quietly meant reallocating what was already scarce. The decision was a clinical one, warped by danger. The man would die without immediate help. The nurse's oath and the Geneva Convention sat like a thin paper in her pocket. Both named the wounded as a single human duty. Oath obliged action where protocol hesitated. A makeshift operating corner took shape beneath a single, swinging lamp when a supply truck failed to arrive, and the next convoy promised only a handful of stretchers. The young German's breathing had gone shallow. June braced his head, kept his airway clear, and squeezed warm saline into a vein with the patience of someone steadying a small vessel at sea. Arthur handed instruments on cue, his fingers trembling only once. The wound was not one for grand surgery. There was no theater, no anesthetist, only steady hands and the meager tools of a field station. She packed the abdominal area with gauze to tamponade internal oozing and folded another bandage over it, whispering for him to breathe. "He'll slip away," an NCO muttered, watching. "Not on my watch," June said, her tone flat. The kind of voice that shut argument down, not with sharpness, but with resolve. Each breath she coaxed from him cost morphine that could have eased an allied corporal farther down the table. Every item used on this enemy man reduced the number in the supply locker. The moral cost was visible in the empty packet she folded into her pocket. Yet the procedure was medicine, not politics. Stabilization buys a patient time, and time could be the difference between life and death. Saving him was a clinical choice wrapped in a larger risk. A nurse's oath kept the hands steady when orders wavered. A mid-afternoon confrontation gathered in the muddy yard when the senior officer returned with anger in his boots. Reports of a prisoner moved into the evacuation queue had reached him. Discipline in a war zone was an instrument as necessary as a bayonet. He stepped into the tent, rain and authority both dripping at his brim. "You disobeyed a direct order," he said, voice hard enough to peel canvas. "He's a patient," June answered, not loud but precise. "You will be recorded as absent without leave. Desertion is..." Arthur moved beside her and produced a neat inked set of notes. "I assessed him. She stabilized him. He needed evacuation," he said, which shifted the weight of words from one person to two. The officer's mouth closed on more than one accusation. He was not a man to be turned by sentiment, but the sight of the young German pale under the lamp softened no orders he had to give. Paperwork would follow, and some would call it betrayal. Others would call it nursing. The work of a dressing station rarely offers clear answers. Command needs neat lines and firm obedience, but medicine follows a different chain, from a steady hand to a living pulse. Her oath held her to that, even when orders pulled the other way. Night brought a thin, temporary calm. The ward became a low, breathing thing, filled with blankets and the close smell of antiseptic touched by sweat. Allied soldiers slept in curls. The enemy man lay between two bunks, his face smudged with dirt and the faint sheen of sweat. June moved among them, attending to swaddled limbs and propping pillows. She checked pulses and murmured the names from papers and memory, an inventory of lives. She noticed a loose photograph in his pocket, a black and white of a woman and a child, edges softened by handling. She did not open it, but she put it where he could feel it when awake. "Where are you from?" she asked softly when he shifted. "From Bremen," he said in rough English, after a pause. Then, quieter, Danke. He had learned a single word that would fit the mouth of a man under a lamp in a foreign field hospital. June answered with a small, steadying nod. There was no triumph in their exchange, only the simple work of human presence. A bandage smoothed, a cup of tea held to lips, a watch checked for rhythm. In the hush, other patients lifted their heads, measuring the borderless humanity that had been set between bunks. Small acts of care remade the ward's geometry. A Red Cross armband on an Irish stretcher bearer, a whispered joke between two privates, a hand pressed to a brow. These were not statements, but stitches. Mercy here folded the enemy's face into a patient's, altering the ward's inventory without a single bureaucratic approval. The oath was alive in small gestures as much as in clinical choices. The call for evacuation came sharp and thin, a single jeep fit for one critical casualty and a load of wounded to follow. The decision of who took the seat became a contested currency. A corporal with a mangled arm was stable, groggy but talking. The German's pulse, though faint, was barely holding. June stood with the paper manifest in her hand and the pocket watch open in the other. The order came from above. Follow the manifest. Zeitzeugen. Manifest said one thing. The clinical urgency said another. He's stable, the corporal said, offering his slot with a hollow smile. Take him. I can wait. Are you sure? Arthur asked, looking at the corporal, then at June. June closed the watch, felt the father's inscription on its inner lid like a quiet command. Do no less. She chose the case that would not survive a delay. Arthur made a note and signed the evacuation slip as co-responsible, an act that placed his name beside hers in official pages, that later would be read in rooms far from mud. The jeep jolted onto the track under a sky that kept rattling with distant shells. At each bump, June checked pulse and gave measured doses of morphine when the body demanded it, explaining only that she was keeping him breathing. The engine's noise swallowed the softer sounds of the road. A groan, a whispered breath. Every mile was a test of restraint. Not the restraint of inaction, but the restraint to use only what kept him alive and nothing wasted. The discipline she showed in dosage and dressings was a mirror of the restraint the oath asked for. At the transfer point, under a lean-to where other ambulances stacked, the young man's color improved. His chest rose deeper, and his fingers no longer curled like broken twigs. The medic on the receiving truck blinked at the sight and snapped a quick report. A few soldiers near the tent had kept an eye on the movement from the yard, and whispers shifted into the clear voice of one who had seen the choice made at close range. She took him. He was slipping, the corporal told the senior officer later, voice steady. I could have waited. She saved him. That witness rebalanced the ledger in a way paperwork alone could not. Formal inquiries would still be filed, and stern faces would still seek to read motives. But the practical report, a man stabilized, a pulse returned to a safer range, an evacuation justified by the living evidence, carried weight. Mercy had been an operational decision as much as an ethical one. It left traces in ink and in the odd tilt of a head when two soldiers later met eyes. Oath had guided them through procedure and peril, and the small record of a life saved would complicate the simple labels others wanted to apply. Morning came thin as a sheet, and the farmhouse filled with the low clatter of lists being read aloud. A supply sergeant rattled off numbers at the table. Ampules counted, bandage rolls logged, one stretcher short and 2 blankets missing. The rumor of June's choice rode those numbers like a current. Men who had watched her move like a machine the day before spoke in softer tones now, measuring what they felt against the ledger that kept them safe. She moved him ahead, a corporal observed, tapping the manifest. Risk to the unit, an NCO snapped, hands on hips. June sat by the window, hands folded, the pocket watch closed on her palm like a small, private weight. She did not explain herself. Explanation would be for forms. In the ward, the enemy soldier breathed easier and turned his head at the sound of voices, eyes clearing as if the fog had been pushed aside. His name, Eric, nodded from a rough scrawl, stayed on June's list of duties the way a prayer might stay on a list of thanks. An audit meant questions. The senior surgeon came with a stack of reports and the kind of face that arranged words into law. He asked about supplies used and the priority given to an enemy name on a tag. Arthur answered with clinical exactness, laying out vitals, times, and the scant options they had faced. The way he spoke anchored the case in medical facts: a pulse that doubled when warmed, a blood pressure that rose after saline, a breathing pattern that steadied with simple suction and positioning. "You used morphine," the surgeon said flatly. "It was titrated," Arthur replied. "Only what was needed to keep airway and heart stable." The surgeon's pen hovered. Rules mattered. They kept chaos from spilling into wholesale waste. Still, the papers he filed were made to take account of life-saving acts, not to excise them from consequence. A field hospital runs on decisions that pair discipline with improvisation. June's choice nested in that tension, a humane action that also had to justify itself to the ledger. Oath required an accounting as much as it required care. Word of the incident moved beyond the yard. A stretcher bearer rumored that June had broken ranks, and a supply clerk wrote a flat note that would move up the chain. Soldiers at the mess argued over what it meant to save an enemy. Some said she had preserved a life. Others muttered about standards, about letting orders be orders when the whole line depended on obedience. "Do your duty," a private muttered, stirring his tea. "Do no less," replied a veteran, looking up into the draft. Inside the dressing room, the pressure shifted to rationing. Morphine was measured like a rare currency. 1 ampule could ease pain for a man who might live, but it could not be squandered. A debate took hold among the nursing staff over whether to conserve for Allied soldiers who might have more tactical value. June knew the calculus intimately. She had been trained that triage is not a moral ranking, but a clinical prioritization based on survivability. The choice to use a dose on Eric was not a softening of war aims. It was a judgment about who would, with immediate help, keep breathing. "He could have bled out on the road," a nurse said, wrenching a cap into place. "And we would have counted his death against nothing," June answered, steady as a needle. Such moments revealed the narrower, harder test. Mercy in a place where resources are finite. The nursing oath insists that the element of care attaches first to life, not to uniform. That rule did not free June from blame. It simply provided a moral and procedural anchor she kept returning to when the ledger and the lullaby of discipline pulled her different ways. Oath and triage stayed side by side like 2 hands holding steady. Eric's recovery was literal and small. A day when he sat up and could sip tea without the gagging cough. A day when a faint color returned to his cheeks and the photograph of the woman and child in his pocket caught light again. He tried to smile once, a thin thing, and pointed at the watch on June's palm as if he had understood the geometry of her decision. "Clock," he said, voice hoarse. "Vader." "Father," June supplied, gently, fitting the word into a sentence like a bandage she smoothed. Those moments cut through the argument about orders. A recovered man tucked the world of his own life back inside him. Hometown, family, memory. Nurses watched and felt the moral current lift a little. For the men who crowded the tents, the sight of an enemy swallowing broth and looking less like death and more like a person rewired something small in the ward. A corporal who had earlier offered his seat to Eric came by and set a small tin of tobacco on the blanket beside him, a gift that needed no language. The preliminary inquest assembled as war business does, briskly, with papers and sober faces. An adjutant asked for statements. The officer who had accused June of desertion filed a report. His language was neat and not unsympathetic, but it framed her choice as an operational breach. Arthur's signature on the evacuation form became a central hinge, the moment when a junior doctor chose to share culpability. He spoke plainly in the room, recounting timelines and describing the condition that demanded immediate action. "You assume responsibility," the adjutant said to Arthur. "I observed," Arthur replied. "I confirmed status. I signed as co-responsible." June answered with fewer words, explaining the clinical facts as neatly as she could. The time the pulse faltered, the lack of alternative resources, the airway that had to be secured. Her tone kept to a nurse's clarity. She did not make speeches. In a room where accusations could turn a career, her measured account read like a clinical note, unadorned, hard to use for anything but practice. Outside the tent, a rumor hardened into a line. She had been called a deserter by some, a hero by others. The label split the camp into small arrangements of loyalty. Some nurses slipped notes under her cot, saying nothing but leaving a thermos of soup. A stretcher bearer who had watched the evacuation quietly offered an account to the adjutant that revised the tale. His testimony that June had prevented a dying man from being left behind complicated the simple charge of desertion. Not every witness was neutral. A supply clerk, frustrated by shortages, argued that saving one enemy might mean letting several allies suffer. The trade-offs were real and raw. Arthur found himself uneasily in the middle of two loyalties, to protocol and to the person beside him who had acted. He had come to the field station as a young doctor eager to apply skill in a place where it mattered. Now his name sat next to hers on a report that could cost them both. He kept a small, practical ledger in his head. Vitals, responses to saline, timing of morphine, and the observable improvement that allowed them to evacuate Eric alive. Each entry was like a small confession in ink. "We did what was necessary," he told a junior medic who sought his counsel. "Necessary doesn't always equal popular," the medic replied. Popularity had little weight against the legal apparatus of military discipline, and yet practical evidence carries its own force. The medic's note that Eric had improved after treatment became a fact that could not be easily denied. Medicine here served as proof and defense. The Geneva Convention's simple injunction that wounded combatants be cared for had weight. It was not merely a moral ideal, but also a rule that could be cited when papers were read in distant headquarters. Oath and convention together provided an argument as well as a conscience. Amid paperwork and witness statements, June found small moments of everyday care to hold on to. She polished the brass of her watch until the inscription blurred into a soft shine. She smoothed a blanket over a sleeping private. She hummed an old lullaby under her breath while changing a dressing. These gestures did not alter the formal processes, but kept her tethered to the human work that had started the controversy. The ward's routine was itself a kind of argument, living, breathing proof that care was not the enemy of discipline, but its neighbor. Outside, the road to the main evacuation point remained dangerous. Shelling closed the route twice that week, delaying convoys and sharpening the logic of triage to a brutal edge. When a new truck finally arrived, the team had to prioritize anew. A platoon sergeant arrived, face lined by mud and command, bringing 3 new casualties and asking for space on the manifest. June took the papers, matched names to faces, and when she came to Eric, she felt an odd, private satisfaction in recording his improving vitals. The watch had become a modest chronicle of a recovery, a measure of breaths saved. "Keep him warm," she told the ambulance driver, handing over a small note of instructions. "He's to be treated as any other casualty?" the driver asked, glancing at the tag. "Treat him first as a patient," June said simply. That phrase, patient first, moved through the station like a soft edict. It did not erase the report pending in an adjutant's drawer, but it shaped the daily work. Nurses and medics began to speak of cases in terms of need, not nationality. That small linguistic shift did its own quiet labor, altering how resources were thought of in the moments they mattered. Mercy here was practical as well as ethical. It changed who received a stretcher and who received a second look. As days passed, the docket piled up, but the ward continued to breathe. Eric learned a few English words. June learned more of his background from a German map tucked into his pack. He drew a rough sketch of a house with a small garden and the letters of his wife's name, and June kept that paper folded into a bandage packet as if it were a talisman. Her colleagues sometimes glanced at it on the shelf, and some smiled when they saw it. A private secret that humanized the controversy. Arguments lingered, but practical realities often decided fates. When a later convoy failed again, the station had to triage rapidly, and June's steady hands were called upon not to argue, but to act. The man with the mangled arm she had spared earlier returned. He had refused evacuation until he was sure Eric would be safe. He clapped a mud-caked palm against June's shoulder in a gesture that said more than words, a soldier's gratitude. That small touch shifted the ledger in human terms. It did not cancel the pending inquiry, but it gave weight to the roster of those who saw June's choice as saving rather than shirking. At night, with rain soft on the tin roof and the tent's lamp low, June sat with the pocket watch open again. She turned the tiny key and watched the hands move in slow, deliberate arcs. The inscription inside the lid, her father's neat letters, felt like a secret counsel. Attend to the living. She understood that her choice might be read as disobedience in some reports and heroism in others. She accepted that the entries would be made and that others would judge them. What she could not accept was leaving him to a slow death when her hands could stop it. The oath had given her a simple imperative. When a dying man lies before you, do what you can. That imperative had led her to act, and it had also placed her where papers and politics might one day search for fault. Oath and consequence had walked together, each step leaving a mark. Later, when people spoke about what she had done, they always came back to the same image. The jeep idled, boots thudding close as the officer read the manifest and pointed at Erich. Hands moved to seize the tag. "Remove him," the officer ordered. "He stays," June said, stepping forward, placing her palm on the young man's chest like a shield. "You'll be court-martialed. Today, he is a patient. My oath is to that first." She stood between the jeep and the stretcher, calm as a metronome, and would not yield. Months later, the armband hung damp and stained on a peg. An empty morphine ampule sat by the lamp like a small, spent currency. Papers that once threatened her name read differently now. Initiative, where desertion had been typed. And the corporal's quiet note, "She saved him," moved through the files. June closed the pocket watch and let the tiny hands rest. Strength is restraint. Civilization is a choice. If this account moved you, subscribe for more true stories of medicine and mercy under fire.